So we're continuing on with our Midnight Pumpkin Fall 2020 Stitch Along with Laura Bosma Pretty Penny Pre-Cuts and your Southeastern Quilt and Textile Museum. We've learned some stitches, blanket stitch or reinforce them, some diagonal couching, and the Lazy Daisy stitch, and we're going to add two more. We'll use chain stitching and or couching with a cross stitch, and that's where we're at in step 8E in your direction booklet. So here we are. What I'm referring to is how are we going to keep this down? This flourish needs some attention paid to it. I often, when I've got a little narrow area like this, I do often like to do a chain stitch over it. So a chain stitch is just continuing the Lazy Daisy stitch one after another. So that's what we're going to do here. Now, this becomes an interesting animal because this one's turned a different direction. But how I handle that is I put one larger chain stitch going in the direction that it wants to face towards the stem. And then when I complete that stitch, I come back to the beginning of it, and then I turn around and go the other way and go down and then restart and go down and then restart underneath there and go down. So that's how I would add the chain stitches. Let me go ahead and stitch some, and then I'll show you how you could also do it with a cross stitch. So from back to front, I'm going to just imagine that I am right here, right where this little teardrop starts to narrow. I'm going to be probably about 1/8 of an inch, 1/16 of an inch closer into that oval teardrop area. I'm going to come up there, and then I'll feel with my index finger underneath that my knot is against the wrong side of the work. I'm going to make that circle, and this one will stand alone, so you would call this stitch a Lazy Daisy stitch. Again, you don't have to go all the way through to the background. In my case, it's flannel. It could be either flannel on your project or wool. I just need to stitch the green to its underneath layer, which is orange. So I've drawn up one Lazy Daisy stitch. I've kind of tapped it. Does it move around? Is it flush against the work? I think it looks pretty good. I'm going to, again, as we did with the flowers, I'm going to hop on the outside of the teardrop up here, and that's what will lock it in place. I am going to go all the way to the back on that. So I put a little bitty stitch right there to lock that in space, in its place, and I'm going to come back underneath the work and come out kind of where we started, right at the bottom of that particular chain stitch. So I'm going to bring my needle back up. Again, I'll say to you a lot of times, don't split stitches, and that's what, unless you're really doing that. And I'll be honest, I haven't done a project yet where I do a split stitch. Once you start splitting stitches, which means you bring your needle up into the existing previous thread, it kind of wants to all jumble together, and it's very difficult to take out if you decide you don't like the way a stitch looks, or if you want to redo something. So I'm going to put my needle kind of right next to it, not in the same hole, but maybe 1 or 2 threads over. And I'm going to go in and back up. Again, all I have to do is get green to orange. My stitch length right here under the barrel of the needle is probably about 1/8 of an inch. If you can get it a little bit longer, cool. But one thing to remember, when you need to curve stitches, which is what we're going to do, in order to get them to turn, they need to get a little smaller. They need to be less long so they'll actually make the turn. Now, I don't have to lock each one of these. I can actually, this time, making it different from Lazy Daisy, I'm going to go back inside the chain stitch next to where my thread came out, right here at the top, at the large portion. I'm going to go in and back up again, another roughly 1/8 of an inch. If I decide my stitch got too long, I'm just going to back it out and try it again. and that's the next one. So each new stitch locks the previous stitch. So again, with the lazy daisy, we had to jump on the outside to lock that stitch. In this case, my stitch right here is locked by this one going over it. My next stitch will be locked by the next one going over it. Let's go one more time. So here's my leading thread right here, right here. I'm going to jump back inside the chain. I'm going to dig in and back up, catching green and orange, keeping my stitches about 1/8 of an inch apart, and then I'm going to pull that up. And that just lays on the top. Admittedly, we haven't done anything with these two edges because it's a curved piece. It's like it's on a bias. It shouldn't fray or do anything. If you're worried about it before you start stitching, just simply put a little bit of fray block right along here. Put a little bit of fray block along each side, or maybe hit points of things if you're worried about it. But I'll be honest with you, I'm not worried about it at all. I'm just going to keep on stitching right through the middle. So let's form that chain stitch one more time. Again, I go inside the chain or teardrop right near where my thread came out. Take a stitch about 1/8 of an inch. Again, all I have to catch is the green layer, which is the stem, and the orange layer, which is the pumpkin. I don't have to go all the way to the back with the teal. And I'm just going to pull that up until I draw that loop up close. So that is a chain stitch. I like it. It's dimensional. It's got a little bit of movement because you've got stuff on its right and left side. So it's certainly a stitch to consider. I'm just going to kind of pin this over here, and I'm going to start a new one. You may decide, that one's okay, but I don't know. So then try this one, and we're gonna just basically we're gonna add another step to this diagonal couching that we did, and that would be to use a cross stitch. I form the cross stitch a little bit differently. If you've ever done any formal cross stitch, you know that you make all the slashes in one direction, and then you come back and you make all the cross hatches in the opposite direction. That does not work for me well on wool applique for the following reason. It's because oftentimes I'm trying to do it over a curve or something that's flowing. It's not a rigid Aida cloth where I know I've got all my holes in the right place and I know my lines are going to perfectly line up. How do I really know this? Because I spent a 6-hour flight doing a whole project in cross stitches, and when I got home I ended up taking 6 hours worth of stitches out because I didn't like how they reacted over a curve. So then, totally by accident, I hit on this, and I actually didn't even know I was doing it until my stitching BFF says, wait a minute, let me see how you're forming those stitches. It's catching the light differently. And I said, what? She said, yes, it's catching the light differently because you're changing the direction each time you make a cross. And I said, okay, watch me do it and tell me what I'm doing. And so that's where we kind of figured it out. So here is what I do. I'm going to make about a 45-degree angle crosshatch across my stem. And again, this is legitimate couching. We're going from one side to the other. I'm going to move over just a little bit, okay? And then I'm going to come up about equal. So I'm kind of doing a swooping stitch. I'm not doing a stab stitch. I came out here. I went in here. And I'm coming out about parallel to where my original thread came out. So that's what I'm going to do. So there's one. Now again, using this as my divining rod / roadmap, I'm going to lay it back across and get myself a really good picture of an X. And that's going to tell me that I want to put my needle in right about there. So I'm going to go ahead and just stab that to the back. Now here's where I change directions. I'm going to come directly across. I went in right here. I want to come back out right next to the toe or foot of this particular stitch. I'm going to come back out here. Get it? There it is. Again, I'm going to use my thread as a road map to get a real nice diagonal going. And so I know I need to go in at the other side of the stem about right there. I'm going to turn my needle a baby bit, and I'm going to come out on the opposite side. And then I'm going to use a road map to get a real good looking X right there, and know that I go right back in at the leg or previous toe on the other side. So what did I do different? Well, Marianne figured out that what I did was I've got this thread on the top, this one forming, let's say it's going from southwest to northeast. And then I've got this one forming where my thread on the top now has formed northeast to southeast. So each time the thread on the top for my X's changes position. One time it's on the top, one time it's on the bottom. And so that's how I'm getting it to do an X. Now it's definitely providing, at least in my mind, quite a bit more coverage over the stem than the chain stitch does. So for you then, that becomes a personal taste thing. Do I want to try it? Do I want to use it in a couple of different places in a different way? Or am I going to pick one over the other? You know, honestly, that is completely and totally up to you. So again, forming another stitch, I'm going to come back out near the toe of the previous one. There's my diagonal. I'm going to lay this down and get the best looking X I can get out of it and go in right here. So practice that and try that. Again, I personally did not have luck doing all the hashes one direction and turning around and doing them all back the other direction because this curves. There's points where, for example, this one, where the top is quite a bit wider open than the bottom, and that's how you're curving. So that's why you would need to form this stitch that way. Be sure that you're watching the YouTube videos. If you're interested in the stitch, go rewind it, watch again, rewind it, watch again. I haven't stated it yet this time, but you know, I am an educator by trade. When I retired from teaching, we were telling our students that you needed to repeat a technique 37 times to knit the brain's pathway. They're now saying it's about 64 times. So maybe you won't get perfection out of the gate, but you will get it over time if you will continue to use and reuse those stitches. So I wish you much happy stitching, and when we return, whether you choose to cross stitch, chain stitch, or both, you'll have all of this flourish stitched down, embellished so that it's permanently down. Thank you again, Laura Bosma, your stitching host, and our ultimate host, the Southeastern Quilt and Textile Museum.